Today you wanted to discuss hell and Satan.
You and I have the same concept in terms of this idea of hell. I saw your video on it and all that stuff, and some people just kind of really, to use an old jazz term, screw the pooch on that concept a great deal.
I never made a video on Satan and hell, just hell alone. I was meaning to make a video of Satan and Judaism's view of Satan.
I don't think I ever did on Satan, but however, I think that, that there is indeed an external, but most times that it's mainly talking about the internal, the Yetzirah.
Mm-hmm. Right. I don't think hell and Satan are necessarily connected. I mean, for sure in Judaism they're not.
In Judaism, the closest thing we have to the Christian concept of Satan or the New Testament Satan is Samael. Now, mind you, the idea of Satan is a Jewish idea, Hasatan, but we don't picture him like as some sort of opponent of God, but someone who at least works for God, at least how it appears in the book of Job. Closest thing we have to the Christian concept,
at least in Kabbalistic circles, is Samael, which is like the king of demons. And that's really an area that I don't teach on, that I don't really even believe. There are many rabbis who didn't believe in demons or this dualistic notion of religion that we parade today in Judaism. I mean, most people don't know, Judaism and Christianity nowadays are virtually identical in terms of how they view the forces of evil and the forces of good. Judaism nowadays has become dualistic, unfortunately. I'm not sure how people, for example, attain Chabad, who pride themselves in teaching the Rambam. I'm not saying they adhere to the Rambam, but they teach a lot on hell. Perhaps it may not be an eternal hell. They also teach on demons and shadim and all these concepts that go against the monotheistic understanding of the Almighty, at least according to the mind of the Rambam. In other words, by introducing or attaching any redemptive quality to demons, you're automatically limiting God, because you're saying that God in some way has opponents, when, at least according to the philosophy of the Rambam, his grandeur is really unimaginable.
It's very similar to the concept of Ein Sof.
At least with the term Ein Sof, those who usually use the term Ein Sof are the ones who believe in demons and stuff like that. From a literal level, yes, to be without end, to be without limit. But Kabbalists themselves constantly limit God. There's a huge limitation. I can't remember. Simsum. The concept of Simsum is a Kabbalistic idea that God in some way contracted himself to create the world. I'm just saying, for those who are big on the Rambam's principles of what God is or isn't, and at the same time espouse the idea made popular by the Uri of Simsum of God actually limiting himself, they really should think these things through. Yeah, so that notion saying that God has opponents, I don't think limits God any more or less than the notion of the Trinity. Two equally silly notions, in my opinion. But in terms of hell, now hell doesn't literally appear in the 5 books of Moses. Although I personally believe in a hell, just like I believe in a heaven. Because heaven also doesn't appear in the 5 books of Moses as some sort of celestial world to come. However, I believe that for God to be just, in other words, life is too short. We see good people suffer and bad people not get what's coming to them. So there has to be something. For example, I don't think that Hitler and Moses should have the same ending. I mean, there has to be some divine justice that overlaps worlds. So that's why I believe in a world to come and a hell, although I don't believe that the Torah requires me to believe in it. Right when you start using words like God requires me or expects me, you're already in advanced religion. The average person makes no distinction. The Torah says, and they'll quote the Alter Rebbe speaking on demons. When we approach theology, we approach it with a scalpel.
Exactly. That's a concept that seems to have kind of transcended both Christianity and Judaism a great deal, and I think that the concept, from what I know so far, is chances are it's probably incorrect. And I remember going to several different primary and secondary sources, and I was actually fired from a Christian college because I did a radio show on this concept of hell and saying, you know what, by looking at the original languages and going through the theology of Agadah Midrashim, as well as, the very few places it's mentioned within that Mishnah, the concept is really flawed what Christianity teaches. And I didn't teach that in the college at all whatsoever. I did it on my radio show. And then I was told, you need to change your theology on this. And I said, well, considering this is a scholarly institution, I think, we can have a conversation about this. You can provide your evidences. I'll provide mine. And then, we can go and see where it is that we come to on this. And here's what I was told. I was told. Just because there's no evidence of something doesn't mean it's not true. And I said, wait a minute, this is coming from a scholarly institution? Seriously?
I don't think, but in areas of the metaphysical, only because something happens to appear in the Mishnah or in the Talmud, that it's any more theologically true than if it appears in the New Testament. Now, I don't believe in the New Testament, but in areas of the metaphysical, whether it's of heaven or hell, where they're automatically delving into topics that are not in Torah, it's all subjective. So no one could say, okay, the rabbis believed in the specific concept of hell, which they didn't. I mean, the notion of hell wasn't monolithic. I'm sure they believed in the idea, but everyone held to their own opinions. But only because the Tanaim, the sages in the Mishnah, espoused one notion of hell, that doesn't make it any more true or valid in any way than if it appears in the New Testament or in the Quran or in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Any metaphysical issue that's outside of the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, is opinion. Because,
but also at the same time, the rabbis and sages do make a connection between the Torah portions, Tazria and Metzora. And basically, I think that's the model, and I tend to agree with the rabbis in terms of this. That is the model for a biblical version of hell. That basically it's almost like, if you kind of think of the Catholic purgatory in some ways, I know that's kind of a bad word in Judaism, Catholic, but however, in terms of the application of it, you say you have a person, you have a child that needs to be put in time out for a little while, so they go to the place that's furthest away from Hashem. And so they kind of go over there and they kind of think about what it is that they did, and then they can progress through the levels of heaven after they've done so, after basically their mitzvah is cleared up.
In terms of purgatory, that's how it's taught nowadays in Judaism, that hell is not a permanent place, but it's a place that you're in some way working out your salvation. It's funny, they're very similar ideas to the New Testament, but they just use different terminology. In terms of those 2 parshas you mentioned, what's used there to identify hell?
What we have there is we have a person that has a spiritual condition known as Negei Zorot. And basically, what the rabbis say in terms of this is that it's brought on by usually Lashon Hara. Now, I like to take it a little bit deeper and say we have to get to the root of Lashon Hara. And we see that the root of it is actually Yetzer Hara. We constantly talk about Lashon Hara. Well, let's get to the root of the issue. Instead of just saying, that we need to stop with the Lashon Hara, let's work on the Yetzer Hara and destroy it, and then we don't even have to worry about Lashon Hara. But what ends up happening is we have the story of Miriam going and, taking issue with Moshe Rabbeinu and with Aharon. And we see that, then it goes into this whole diatribe of people getting Metzora, getting leprosy. And so, the thing about those is that, medically speaking, a person doesn't, their leprosy doesn't clear up. A person doesn't go and check them and say, oh yeah, just a couple of more days, and then you'll be good. So there's something else that's going on here. And so, the rabbis and sages are talking about this, and they're talking about, going and, having them outside of the camp for a duration of time. And then, after they're checked and they're all cleared up, and they are allowed to come back into the camp. Now, the thing about it, though, is that what caused them to be outside of the camp, what brought on the Matzar, well, it's the Negezerot, the spiritual condition that caused the physical to manifest itself.
That's really the rabbis reading into it. The Torah doesn't specifically say Lashon Hara causes saras. The Torah itself never even mentions a Yetzer Hara. Now, these are all concepts that I embrace, but we have to be very careful when we say the Torah teaches and then just quote a rabbi. The authority of the rabbis are only for legal things. Everything else they say on the Torah is subjective. I mean, it may be true, it may not be true. I think the average rabbi today who uses that terminology doesn't even know what Lashon Hara is. Nowadays, people are accused for Lashon Hara even when they say something good about someone.
Exactly.
It's kind of nonsensical. I mean, I'm against the whole Shmiras HaLashon of the Chafetz Chaim. There's a lot of bad things that have occurred because of his works. Child molesters not being adjudicated, not being singled out because of Lashon Hara, right, or the fear of Lashon Hara. They make no distinction nowadays between Motze Shemra, Lashon Hara that's letoelet for a constructive purpose. But in terms of hell, if that's the most the rabbis could use to point to some place of torment, it doesn't sound really too impressive. I understand that's perhaps where the idea of purgatory comes in. The way it's dealt with nowadays, now mind you, in the times of the Mishnah and the Talmud, people weren't saying Kaddish for their dead relatives to come out of Gehenna, right? I mean, that's something they do nowadays. And it's basically identical to purgatory.
Yeah.
With indulgences.
You're absolutely right. You know, I think that the premise is there, but however, the premise has kind of morphed itself in many ways into something that it was never intended to be taught. You know, because obviously there's a concept there that both religions have ascribed to, but however, you see how they're so vastly different on different ends of the spectrum. And I think that the truth is somewhere in between. But at the same time, however, this is something that causes a great divide in many ways in terms of theology within that of Judaism. That we could say, like you said, it's very subjective. A person, we could see how different halakha has gone and morphed over time, and all this other stuff had to do with teaching. A couple of weeks ago on reincarnation, because I kept seeing this pop up within that of Rabbi Shalom Arush's books, reincarnation. So I had to go back and, say, well, where did this concept stem from, and then I had to go to, I know that, you're not a big fan of the Zohar, but, the first place that this pops up is within the Zohar. So I was sitting up there looking at it, and I was like, the word reincarnation is not even in there in the Hebrew and the Aramaic. Instead, it has it technically goes and translates to, and he died and rejected death. Saying that's tekiyah. That's resurrection of the dead. That's not reincarnation. But then
the word they use for reincarnation is Gilgulim.
Yeah, but that concept, the word Gilgul is nowhere within that of the passages in the English translation of the Zohar. And I was sitting there going, well, where's this at? I'm not finding it in here, but I'm finding it in the English translation. So I'm sitting over there saying to myself, well, wait a minute here. Why is this concept being taught in this way? Well, it must be being taught by people like Rabbi Shalom Arush and Rabbi Nachman and so on and so forth in terms of Agadah and Midrashim, because if they're thinking of a literal reincarnation, then there's some real issues that they're coming up with here.
Techiyat HaMeitim and Gilgulim are two different things. I honestly don't think how they can both exist at the same time. Yeah, I mean, the resurrection of the dead and reincarnation, both, in my opinion, are non-Torah beliefs. The resurrection of the dead doesn't appear in the 5 books of Moses, although Meforshim like Rashi and others try to make some sort of connections. It's just not there. And
just like with the concept of hell, too, how that's kind of morphed into the way that it's seen now in some sects of Judaism and predominantly in Christianity as well.
But now it's used as a way to scare you into being religious. If you read the Torah straight through, you really get a sense that the Almighty wanted us to do good, ultimately for goodness sake. And that's an idea that's completely lost nowadays. Nowadays, if somebody confronts you in the Christian, Jewish, or Muslim world, the first notion he's going to entertain is the idea if you know where you're going to go after you die. Like that's even important. Instead of focusing on ethics and making this world a better place or leaving it a little better than you found it, striving for peace, working on your family. Now these are principles that are laid down in Torah, but the notion of heaven or hell, of reward and punishment, doesn't appear in the Torah. That's all of religion nowadays. Even in Judaism. In Judaism, one thing that attracts Gentiles to this Noahide movement is the subjective idea that if a Gentile keeps the seven laws of Noah, that some rabbis teach that they'll go to heaven. They don't use that term. They say, have a share in the world to come. It's the same thing. That is what draws people into being religious nowadays. It's not how ethically productive can I be, because if people ask themselves that question, I mean, everyone would be Jewish, right? I mean, we have the most laws. We have perfected individual moral training in our code. People don't ask that anymore, but people just don't want to go to hell. It's kind of like a limited, immature way to approach religion. And Islam is big on this, with heaven and hell.
Yeah, and the thing about though is that I know that the Yerushalmi Talmud is not used as often as the Babylonian. But however, even within the Yerushalmi Talmud, which is still considered to be a holy text within that of Judaism, it says that a B'nai Noah can be found to be just as lofty in the eye of Hashem as one who is a Baal HaTarah. And so with that, I sit there and I say, and whether or not that was in the Mishnah section or within the Gemara section of the Yerushalmi, I sit there and I think about that, and it gives credence to what it is that you're saying there, because it's almost like that we have to abandon what ancient Judaism actually said in terms of this, and then adopt this new thing to get basically more butts in the seats,
Again, the area of heaven and hell is a metaphysical area. So that means anything that's not in the Torah, that it's metaphysical, is optional to believe. Because the Torah, the instructions, specifically the instructions within the Torah, are the only divine works we have. The words of the prophets are there to just bring us back to the Torah. Because no one's died and come back again and is here to tell us what actually happens in the heavenly spheres, all we have to rely in the metaphysical and the spiritual is what appears in the 5 books of Moses. That's really the basis of Islam. All this terror that we're seeing with ISIS and all these other groups is people who become so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good anymore. In other words, it's all about the next life. And there's even a statement like this in the Mishnah, that this world is just the corridor, right? But the real place is the world to come. That's a really sick mindset. There's many rabbis who attack that notion also, that someone who asks what comes after, what's before, what's above, or what's below, it's better that he should never have been born. So in other words, it's not a monolithic idea that Jews are just dying to get to heaven. Mishnaic and rabbinic literature is really a mixture of a bunch of different ideas, but if the person who's teaching you is a mystic, he's only going to show you the mystical side and not the rational side that typically fights against that side.
I think that again, it kind of falls within the middle, because Pirkei Avot also says, do not serve a master for the sake of receiving a reward. Instead, serve a master for the sake of not receiving a reward, and may the awe of heaven be upon you. Now, in terms of what the Maharal said in terms of the Der Chaim and his commentary on that, I have no clue what it is that he said, though I studied it years ago. The thing that I do have to say, though, is at the same time, with that concept, if a person is worried about when they die, how are they able to focus in on what it is that they are supposed to do here?
It's interesting how we have so much to say about this topic, because that's what religion has become. We're not people of dignity, of integrity anymore. Everything is reward, payment. And I understand that God's a righteous God and a laborer deserves his payment, but it's not about goodness and ethics anymore. And that's with any religion. I don't think any religion nowadays asks, how can you make the world better? It just tries to get you out of hell. And really, well, that could create any religion, because, right, when you establish a place like hell in your theology, anything you say going the opposite direction is going to be received. Nobody wants to go to hell.
Now, see, I have to wonder, does like individuals such as when Schneerson was alive, did he have kind of a dual mindset, and did he go and adopt the idea of an eternal, burning in fire hell that came from Dante's Inferno, while at the same time going and teaching Tikkun Olam? Because those two concepts would kind of be combative with one another, essentially, I would think.
I don't think we specifically spoke about a place of burning for eternity, but there are many people who teach, especially in mystical circles, that hell is really a displacement. It's a separation from God. The notion of eternal punishment does exist in Talmudic literature. There's an idea of Yeshu. Now, I doubt this is the same individual of the New Testament.
I don't think it is either. I read Rabbi Shmuley Batayak's book on that, and
so there's an idea, Soar Rotzachat, of the boiling cauldron of excrement that God places heretics in to burn for eternity. So the concept is there. It's typically not used, just because I don't think people want to associate themselves with the lingo used by Christians, but it's for sure a Jewish idea. Jewish in the sense that, it was mentioned by Jewish people. It's for sure not in the Torah. But the accepted understanding of hell nowadays is just this purgatory that one spends maximum of 12 months, really 11 to 12 months, and one's relatives say Kaddish for you to get you out of there quicker. That really wasn't the intention of Kaddish in the beginning. Kaddish didn't even mention death. But the Zohar took the mourner's Kaddish, really Kaddish Atum. The mourner's Kaddish is really the orphan's Kaddish, and made it into a get out of hell mantra. And this is really post the 12th century. And nowadays people only go to shul to say Kaddish. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. They don't realize that our sages never said this. Of course they said Kaddish, but it wasn't to get your relatives out of hell. So there are people who will miss a flight just because they have to say Kaddish for their dead relative, and no one asks, is this halachic? Nobody asks. I have a whole video on this, by the way, if anyone wants to watch it.
Yeah. Oh, and it's a good video, too. I encourage
it's ancestor worship. That's what it is. It's really a form of ancestor worship. In life, we always have to know where everything comes from. And we always have to be able to dissect what we believe, our theology, and not just accept everything like it was given at Mount Sinai, which is how it's taught nowadays. Rabbis nowadays are just very lazy. So then all they say is everything was given at Mount Sinai. And even what my teacher taught was given at Mount Sinai. That's why there's a huge dumbing down of Jewish people nowadays. They just don't know. And it's kind of scary when you see them in these lectures and they're just quoting their teacher. Well, instead of going to the source and just saying, what does the Torah say? And I believe in the oral law. I think that by believing in the oral law, it allows me to properly elevate the Torah in a proper manner than just kind of lumping it all together. Everything all together and as all given on Mount Sinai. It's kind of, whatever. That's what I do. I try to get people to think for themselves. And,
of course, and you quoted, when you started, you quoted Gittin 57A or B, I believe is where that passage is. Now my translation doesn't say Yeshu. It says Balaam, and there are some discrepancies of what it actually says in there, of course. But the ultimate thing it was a whole medrash there about those who try and operate outside of Judaism by rejecting the rulings of the Sanhedrin, like the Samaritans and all of these things. And for those of your listeners who don't know, I am a believer in Yeshua HaNotzri. I am a believer of Yeshua of Nazareth. And the thing about this, I see him use this same kind of agadic thing, and when he's talking about this concept as well, because he's making mention of a place that was actually a literal place within that, and I'm having to source the Delitzsch Hebrew Gospels, even though it was 16th century. I'm sourcing that for the Hebrew equivalent because I found Franz Delitzsch to be much smarter than I am. And, he uses the word Gehenna there, which was actually, a garbage dump, and all that stuff. And he's bringing up this character Lazarus. This character Lazarus was alive at this time. So it should have been an indication to people who are in Christianity and reading their Bibles or in Messianic Judaism or in the Hebrew roots or what, sort of splinter group that has derived from that this was a statement of midrashim, that this was used in the same way as, the story in Gittin 57.
I've always asked myself, if someone doesn't believe in a hell, how can they at the same time say that they embrace the teachings of the New Testament, which, although the New Testament doesn't really mention hell as it's described today by the Catholic or Dante's Inferno, but it does ultimately end with the lake of fire.
And I think that's a literal part of actually a sub-level book, as a matter of fact, It's mentioned in the book of Revelation. And it's saying that we will literally walk on their ashes. I mean, so wait a minute, if they're burning forever in a lake of fire, how the heck can we be walking on their ashes? People just don't get the concept. They take it out of context just because they've adopted these things, and then they go to a small level of Jewish observance, whether they want to call it Jewish or not. They go to a small level of Jewish observance, and then they, seem to carry with them some of this baggage, some of this theology that they have had before.
But in terms of the lake of fire, I don't think it says about anyone walking on anyone's ashes. It even says that hell and Hades cast into the lake of fire. So it seems like the lake of fire is this place of torment. It seems like it's a 100% New Testament belief. Not that it made it up. I mean, I believe it was made up by Jews. But it's kind of hard to feel that you need a savior and at the same time say that you don't believe in a place of torment.
Well,
in other words, a place.
I have a different take on the Book of Revelation than most people do. It tips a lot of people off. I tend to see it as, the whole Book of Revelation almost talking about a battle between Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara. And it's done in such a Jewish way that, people are sitting there, watching the news thinking that they're, what's happening in the news today? How does this relate to the end times? That's not what it's talking about there, I don't think.
I believe that Christianity, or at least the early Nazarenes, were really heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism teaches about this war of the sons of darkness fighting the sons of light. I mean, it's as dualistic as mystical Judaism was during the time of the Second Temple. It's not nothing new to us. It's for sure not in the Torah.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes in the Book of Enoch, which is a huge fraudulent document. First of all, it's 18th century and people think it's ancient, and you see a lot of,
Well, there's 4 books of Enoch, but I think the first 2 people have validated as much earlier. The last 2, there's concepts in there that seem straight out of the Book of Revelation that's what people think there's like church's influence in it.
Well, I see a lot of the the Greek Orthodox Church influence in there. Such a concept of Genesis 6, them talking about fallen angels coming and having sex with women and all these other things. Where we see that's even within the I believe it's in the Talmud, or it might have been Rashi who said that these were men of great renown, and we see the term B'nai Elohim mentioned many places within the Bible. We see it referred to as the children of Israel. We see Yeshua go and tell his disciples, "You are all B'nai Elohim." Are they saying that the children of Israel were fallen angels? And all this stuff. So there's a concept that it seems to have much later premise that was probably founded within the Greek Orthodox Church, and there were 2 pages of Enoch within that of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there were a lot of documents within the Dead Sea Scrolls that weren't necessarily biblical literature. And the thing is that those 2 pages from the Dead Sea Scrolls don't align with the Ethiopic text, which is the only quote-unquote full text that we have of Enoch.
Well, this predates Christianity in general, with the idea that the Nephilim were giants, half angel, half human. I don't believe that. I mean, I believe, like you say, that when it says B'nai Elohim, it just means human. Early mystics really ran with that and tried to use that as a catalyst to introduce demons into Judaism, when the Torah really doesn't mention any.
And the thing about this is the reason why I think that has become so much a part of the mainstream today is because, guess what? The Book of Enoch, in its early translations, are public domain. So, if you want to put a couple of bucks in your pocket, what are you going to do? You're going to make a sacred name version of the Book of Enoch.
Right.
And so
there's a lot of offshoots nowadays that are built off of Apocrypha. And for some reason, there's this understanding, if it's old and it mentions biblical characters, it's divinely inspired and doctrine should be built upon it. It's really the fault of the rabbis. But they see a Jew walking out with a Tanakh, and they fail to remind them that the Tanakh is ultimately a Catholic invention. Not the books in the Tanakh, but the idea that we lump other works alongside the Torah is something no Jew would ever have done. Now, even if you walk into a synagogue, there's a Sefer Torah, and then for the Haftorah, they'll read either from a different Sefer or just a regular back part of the Chumash. But this idea that we lump all the Hebrew writings together and in some way walk around saying this is all divinely inspired is really Judaism's response to the Christian Bible, because that's how the Catholics had it. The Catholics had Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim all together, and on top of that, they attach the New Testament. Like Mormons go further. They have what they call the Old, the New, and then the Book of Mormon, and some even add the Pearl of Great Price to that end of it. Chabad also has a similar thing. They have something called Chitas, which is the Chumash, Tehillim, and Tanya. All of this, it breaks our theological compass, because we start to think that something that appears in Sefer Yeshayahu is on the same level as something that appears in Shemot. There's a huge distinction, and this is why groups like the Black Hebrews are here quoting the Book of Enoch and all these Bel and the Dragon and the Wisdom of Solomon and all this stuff, because they think, hey, who's to say that this isn't inspired also? Because the rabbis haven't laid down the parameters and explained how all these books came into being, how the rabbis themselves wrote many of these books and just introduced it into the Jewish world to give Israel a historical account of Jewish history and how God acted throughout history and how he gave opportunities to his people to repent and return to Torah, but not to build a religion off of. The Torah is everything. The 5 books is everything. And if the 5 books doesn't endorse it, it's not called Judaism. In other words,
my question would then be, in terms of when you say that Tanakh was a Catholic invention, I then have to say to ask then, I disagree with the Karaite a great deal, but they did compile the Septuagint, which again, the Talmud says, curses any man who raises swine, curses any man who teaches some Greek or Greek wisdom, but it is a historically revealing document in many ways. So, I would think that, the canonization of the Tanakh came way before Catholicism, considering that the Septuagint itself, from a chronological historical order, is dated between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century BCE.
The translation of the Septuagint you're thinking about was only the 5 books of Moses. The complete Tanakh Septuagint now wasn't compiled until after the death of Jesus. In other words, these books existed, they were floating around, but the final canon wasn't decided upon. In the Talmud, we have rabbis like Rabbi Akiva arguing for Sefer Yehezkel, Kohelet, Shir Hashirim. All these books weren't going to be included. Megillat Esther wasn't going to be included in the canon. Beit Shammai never accepted Megillat Esther as part of books that were Mitzvah Yadayim, books that cause your hands to become impure, which is really what divinely inspired text meant to the Jewish people. It was more like of a halachic thing of cleanliness and uncleanliness than actual books that were inspired by God. So in the time of Jesus, this is why it shows them grabbing a scroll here, a scroll there. There was no Tanakh. There was no final decision of what books were canonized. And you can look at this. The 70, it is called the Septuagint because it was a group of 70 scholars that were put in different rooms, or at least that's how the tale goes. And they all appeared with the same translation, but that's only of the 5 books of Moses. And then later on, there appeared Greek versions of the books of the prophets that people combined into what they call the Septuagint today, but it's not the same work. Even the Septuagint we have nowadays, the one produced by Hebrew scholars, is not the original Septuagint. That one was supposedly lost. Even the Greek that it's written in nowadays is not the authentic Koine Greek. It's an area that many people misquote.
Okay. Well, here'd be another way to look at it as well. Is at the same time, now I'm not a fan of the pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha, or any of these extra, books that, people, have found are public domain are now trying to tout to everybody with their own, find and replace options by putting in, variations of the 4-letter name of God into them. But at the same time, I almost have to ask myself, are these things beneficial not for theology or halakha, but rather in terms of understanding the theologies during the periods of time in which they were written by the common people? I would say in many ways that they are beneficial in that manner, but not in terms of theology.
I would say the same thing about the books in Nach also. Only because something was accepted by the men of the Great Assembly and afterward to disseminate amongst Israel, you have to realize these are also books outside the Torah. These books are just there to bring you back to Torah. So like if you're reading the Wisdom of Solomon and you're seeing good stuff there, things that you can clearly see are bringing you back to the Torah's understanding of things, then for sure it's great to follow. I mean, I don't think why it's any more important than Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is not a book of halacha. It's just Musar. It's ethics. Is it a little more inspired than something apocryphal? Not at all. I mean, why should it be? It's still ethics outside the Torah, but it's ethics bringing you back to the Torah. Even if you wrote something, if I wrote something that moves you to become a better person, to have more of a Torah mindset, then it's just as valid and acceptable and usable as the writings of prophets with the apocryphas, the pseudepigraphas. Everything outside the Torah is secondary, and it's just there to amplify the Torah. So whatever book helps amplify the Torah, then that is inspired. Now, it's clearly not inspired like the Torah is inspired, like a direct inspiration from God, right? But it's there to cause you to do good things. And this is really how we have to view Nach. Because Nach was compiled by rabbis, right? I mean, the book of Tehillim. All these poems weren't necessarily written by King David, but they were there to inspire you to do good things. But you always have to make a distinction between that and Torah. And nobody makes that distinction nowadays. Right? I mean, people quote doctrinal ideas straight from the book of Psalms. How idiotic. People really have gone astray.
I agree with you with your concept there, like 75%. And I'll even give you a little bit of credence on this as well from what it actually says in Pirkei Avos. Because the thing that just came to mind was that it says that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua to the elders, to the prophets, and to the prophets transmitted it to the men of the Great Assembly, and the men of the Great Assembly said 3 things. Be diligent in judgment, develop many disciples, and build a fence around the Torah. Now, it doesn't say that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Tanakh and said to build to build a fence around the Tanakh. So with that, I can say that I can give you a little bit of credence on that.
It's talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's talking about the oral law that was passed down through the generations, right? But the authority began through Moses, and then God put on the elders what he initially put on Moses, and it was transmitted. And the beginning of Perkei Avos lays down that transmission. It mentions all the prophets, not mentioned because of their prophetical ability, but because each of them were the heads of their own courts, and it was passed down from court to court.